So first, I just want to thank you so much for agreeing to meet with the JLA and getting to hear your thoughts on your most recently submitted article. Before we get into that, though, I would love to hear a little bit more about who you are and the kinds of research that you do.
Awesome. Well, my name is Sonya Pritzker. I am an anthropologist and a licensed practitioner of Chinese medicine, which is, I'm not sure a ton of folks still know that about me, but I do practice. I'm a medical and linguistic anthropologist. My advisors at UCLA were Eleanor Oakes and Linda Garrow, so one linguistic anthropologist, one medical anthropologist. However, since 2015, I've been the resident linguistic anthropologist here at the University of Alabama, Department of Anthropology. I am the only linguistic anthropologist, as many of us are, which has been actually really fun. And it's allowed me to carry on the lineage that I'm really excited to be a part of. My work very broadly focuses on language in the body across all different contexts. So, like in Chinese medicine, between bodies, among couples, um, and in the context of um, therapeutic self-development in China. So my work is focused mostly on China and the U.S., and in this case, in the field of embodied social justice.
That's wonderful. I'm glad that you're able to kind of connect that sort of like medical and linguistic anthropology. It makes for some really interesting conversations about the body, which is a perfect segue into receiving a summary of the article that you just had submitted to the JLA. So we would love to hear all about it.
Um, right. So the project that it comes out of is called the Living Justice Project. It is a project that was funded with an NSF Career Award. I was very honored to receive that in 2020. Um, and the funding overall was to continue the work on biolinguistic anthropology, which I haven't published much of in JLA. There is a relatively recent article in the journal Ethos that describes it. Basically, I work with human biologists and other biological and biocultural anthropologists in my department. My department is well known for biocultural medical anthropology, and so working with them to look at how uh, biocultural anthropologists look at how the body is shaped by culture over time, right? So how a lot of differences uh, across communities come from the are not inherent, right? We're very much not different from one another across different demographics. However, different configurations of the social environment lead to different biological outcomes, and that's what biocultural medical anthropologists do. And I like to think of it as, in linguistic anthropology, we look at how culture emerges through interaction. So not just language, but um, discourse or, communication more broadly, conceived like gesture, eye gaze, um, facial gestures, all kinds of stuff. So I like to think of biolinguistic as both how culture shapes the body and how the body shapes culture, and then how interaction shapes culture. So how interaction shapes the body, and back and forth. And my colleagues and I were really kind of surprised that these had never been seriously combined. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think it's because of the scale of data. Linguistic anthropologists tend to look at the micro, and if you're looking at population biology, you're looking at much larger sample sizes. However, we've been working in many ways to combine them at different scales, whether in big projects where we're doing simultaneous psychophysiology and video recording, to more theoretical engagements with students who are using mostly Lean methods, but are also talking about the biological body, or vice versa, students who are talking about the biological body, and then incorporate linguistic anthropological theory. So that's the broader project. In 2020, when it was funded to continue that work with couples, um, originally one of whom who works full or part-time in social justice. So we've done that work with couples in the home because it's really easy to kind of see and it's easy to figure out where to put your video camera when you're looking at couples, right? Because we're together a lot as in our relationships. But I really wanted to extend it beyond the home, and I was really interested in how the work of contributing to social justice um, being affected by issues and living in the world, how that affects relationships and therefore the body, how our body feels the stresses of either our successes or there's also this long-standing kind of moral dilemma in activism that where we have to work ourselves kind of to the bone. And so I actually see a lot of patients and have experienced myself, like the work itself doesn't necessarily always take into account the health of the person doing the work, even though it's very much geared to help the health of other bodies, right? So I was really interested in that, and I was going to do then, couples, one of whom works in this field, and so what kinds of support or stress or something more neutral do relationships with children and family more broadly add to the work of activism. Now, when 2020 came about, um, I had to go remote. I also had, uh, observed that the more people you have in the room and the more psychophysiology that you're doing with people, so measuring people's heart rates, their patterns of stress response, and their sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, which is like basically how do we calm down when we're stressed out, and how does the interaction itself support calming down, or does it drive us up? The more you have that, um, the more statistically complex it gets. And so even my human biologist colleagues were looking at really, really complicated data. So I was thinking, well, what if we do the individual, right? Where we can combine qualitative research and interviews and talk to people about how their everyday experiences may or may not relate to their embodied sensations. So I also draw a lot on psychological anthropology, like the lived experience, the phenomenology of experience. So what are people saying about the ways in which their body and their anxiety or their joy or their fatigue is related to certain interactions they're having, and measure their physiology at the same time, to try to make sense of it without adding the complication of someone else, right? So I was already thinking of that when we had to go online. The project was funded in August 2020. So yeah. So the NSF had me rewrite a lot of the core you know, methods, really. I mean, there was no travel. It was not anticipated to be any travel for a while. At the same time, some long-term friends and colleagues had been participating in the kind of what I refer to in the article as embodied justice, and it's really a broad sort of interdisciplinary, not necessarily a single community, but it's an interlinked network of folks who are observing both that the field of activism and movements for justice are uh, consistently plagued by you know, this tension at the heart of it, where we're not taking care of our own bodies, where it's like you just work yourself to the bone to achieve this policy result, and it's important work, and yet some of the tensions say that prevail between differently positioned groups, even within movement, can come into the space, and we need tools to to be able to process conflict, to be able to really care for one another. So it really is grounded in the work of folks like Adrienne Marie Brown, Rev. Angel Kyoto Williams, um, Hala Corey, Tessa Hicks Peterson, lots of folks that I cite in the article. So long story short, in 2020, and then in early 2021, um, this came together in a unique format, which was really accessible and allowed for online workshops with up to, I think the first embodied social justice certificate program had like 700 people all over the world. And previously it had been sort of restricted to small retreat groups. I was aware of several different organizations in California. However, this sort of momentum of not just the pandemic, but and not certainly not just the Black Lives Matter movements. These are folks who'd been working in this area for a long time. So I really want to underscore this is not some fad that
Yeah.
came about. I think it was just kind of a product of technology. So that was where I did the initial ethnography and I was lucky enough to be able to connect with many of the stakeholders in the field, and from that, really formulate the next part of the ethnographic question and say, what do you want to know? What do you want to learn? And then from that, we did a huge collaborative. It was huge because we had so much interest, right? We received, I think, almost 100. Uh, we sent out one email. We received almost 100 signups or on the we had a waiting list. We originally wanted like 20 to 30 people and it was so we were able to figure out 54 and we did three time capsules, which are simultaneous collaborative ethnographic documentations focused on the question of what does it look, feel, and sound like to work to embody justice in everyday life. So these were all folks who had attended these workshops where I think I summarize it a bit in the article, but a lot of the workshops include lectures as well as exercises where people really work on, say, there's recognizing trauma responses, come to question our ways of orienting in the world, and really, even despite our values, we sometimes act from a place of trauma regardless. And so it really draws on a lot of self-development healing work, which is traditionally thought of as like very focused on the self, right? Like we develop ourselves, it's very entrepreneurial. It's really contrasted with the work of activism. But in these spaces, we're doing it for the work of building community and enacting social justice across all aspects of our lives. So that's the background of the project. What we did was we sent out this one email and said, do you want to participate in this collaborative project? And you could sign right up for a Calendly invite. I had a wonderful graduate research assistant, and we made ourselves available on Calendly, and people just signed right up all the way out for 3 or 4 months. And most everyone showed up. I think we had maybe 4 who didn't. We invited folks to participate as named collaborators. So their names are given in the article. For most folks, we had 3 who chose anonymity or basically confidentiality. They didn't want to share their names. So during that interview, it was 2 hours. We started it using a method called microphenomenology, which I won't get into now. It's a really intense guided interview method that looks at lived experience. So we asked about particular moments of learning, moments of inspiration. We did our best to avoid doing any deep dives into trauma unless invited to do so unless someone was willing to share with us particularly troubling experiences. So we were really interested in what folks learn in these workshops, what their experience is, how it has changed their practice in everyday life, what it means to them, why they're doing it. And one of the questions that we asked, which I don't know what inspired me to do this, was just to ask, how do you define social justice? And I was really, because I was really interested, because there's no single definition that I have particularly found. And I've found that, a lot of the communicative difficulties in terms of students who are coming from, say, a more conservative point of view or a more liberal point of view in class, I found that, a lot of the values that students have are actually overlapping, right? And the word itself, however, triggers a different response in different people, right? So I've had a student tell me social justice, that sounds like it divides people. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. So I want to hear from folks, obviously this is a very specific population that engages in these workshops. So it was a particular community who did not have that perspective, but I still wanted to know, how do you define social justice? And it turned out to be one of the most fascinating projects, sort of under this whole rubric. We do have a book coming out soon from New Village Press that covers the whole project. But in terms of just this one question, that's what this paper focuses on, is how do you define social justice? And what I found was that people had a variety of different responses. And I was really interested in looking at the chronotopes that people use to map the world. So chronotopes is a fancy word, but what it means, according to Mikhail Bakhtin, who came up with the term, it refers to how we narrate ourselves in time and space, right? So how do we orient ourselves? And in the novel where Bakhtin originally looked at it, it's like this idea of the road. We travel on a road, right? And these things happen to us. He refers to that as adventure time, right? And or the parlor in sort of modern literature. The idea of everything happens in the parlor. So that we understand ourselves in these conceptualizations of space and time, right? So, a lot of anthropologists have looked at it in terms of do we understand? So Kit Woolard has looked at how folks understand themselves in psychological, like as a psychological development or in terms of national development. I've looked at it in terms of in China, how folks understand, you know, uh, uh, themselves to be citizens of the Chinese nation, in contrast to the West. So a lot of times, a lot of my work looks at sort of East-West dichotomies. And so I was really interested in looking at how folks mapped these definitions of social justice. Now, one of the cool things about this article is that all of the work comes from collaboration. So whenever I had an idea, I would bring it to our open meetings where we had for almost 2 years met monthly to process data and to make sense of it together. So I brought this to my collaborators and I was like, okay, look at how you define this. This is really interesting. And from that, we began looking at, and that's why the authorship is a little odd, because I want to take responsibility. I wrote it. For JLA, I didn't think, although I had many collaborators with PhDs and a lot of higher education, just because of who they are. I wanted to take authorial responsibility while also acknowledging their contribution. So it's me with the collaborators. Um, and so we looked at the ways in which traditional were commonplace definitions of social justice as issued by, for example, the United Nations, as well as grassroots activist groups, as well as other researchers in various fields have looked at like how we can better define social justice. Um, and So from that, we compared, right? What are the differences in the ways in which folks in the field of embodied justice are understanding this term? Is there any consistency, right? And basically, we observed that there were there were three kind of core differences, which I want to say map onto, not intentionally mapped onto um, the idea of equality, recognition, and progress, which are chronotopes that have been identified by other scholars as really informing definitions of social justice as they circulate in organizations. And so the idea that we all deserve equal resources, we should have equal access to such resources, and that with recognition, the idea is that we should shift our gaze to see others and to really witness their experience. And progress means that we're working towards a more just future. So all of those are great. None of us, it's like I really want to take care, none of us disagree with any of those things. However, um, looking at, and this is where I really benefited from scholarship that has looked in Linganth and sociolinguistics and across fields, has looked at chronotopes of social justice to really see how all three of those, well, equality and recognition, really rely on a spatial mapping where you have the center and the periphery, right? So that social justice is directed towards giving access to folks on the periphery, right, to come to the center, where the center of power is. And it is also focused on the gaze of those at the center. Um, and, whether this maps onto privilege in whatever way, it's often those who are at the center of power who are guided to shift their gaze to look at those on the periphery, right? And then with progress, it's a chronotope that looks at the present as inherently unjust, right? As suffering. We have to suffer to we have to want something better in the future and that we're working towards it. So we're never actually achieving it. And these are problematic in a number of ways that other scholars have noted because it sort of perpetuates this idea that there is a center and a periphery, right? Like if we're defining justice within these chronotopic terms, where we're mapping the world in this way, then there will always have to be a center and a periphery, right? And the actors who enact justice, though I don't think it's intended this way, often end up being the privileged, right? Who are, and so they reproduce this idea of like charity, of the person who is engaging in justice is offering charity to the less privileged. And what that does is it decenters the voices of those who are, for whatever reason, situated on the margins. And it um, perpetuates the power of those in the center. And with embodied social justice, what we observed is these ways of defining social justice that draw on this literature of somatic psychotherapy and even mindfulness and meditation and ecstatic movement, and healing, really center the body. And in doing so, they undermine and really, I don't want to say undermine. It's really been difficult in writing this article because I don't want to say that there's in contrast because we accept equality, recognition, and progress. We're all on board with that. And it's really not a but an and, right? So it's like, and what happens when we put the body at the center of our definition of social justice? We really found that um, offers new ways to think about equality in this moment across bodies, in the space we're sharing together now. So whether we're not too focused on whether we're at the center or the periphery. We're not too focused on providing access uh, to folks who don't have access. We all need access to this kind of interconnection, where we show up um, together as equals in a struggle to thrive, to be in community with one another, to understand one another, where we are able to face conflict in generative ways, so it really shifts the way we think about equality. It also shifts the way we think about recognition. So instead of just recognizing the suffering other, which is often how recognition is defined, or it's defined in terms of, Nancy Fraser talks a lot about how it's defined in terms of recognizing um, different groups, right? It's sort of, here's these identity groups. You are, either racially identified, politically identified, or whatever it is, right? You're fixed in that, and that, we need to recognize one another, and we do. And part of what's interesting in embodied social justice is that we also need to recognize um, the world in ourselves, right? So and ourselves in the world. So I can get into that a little bit more. It like with equality, it really shifts the way we're thinking about what our responsibility is, because recognition is often associated with responsibility in terms of not enacting passive injustice or whatever. And the way I talk about it in the article is response dash ability. So it's the capacity to respond in the moment to whatever's happening, right? So it's not just seeing an other, it's seeing sometimes in myself, oh, I just made a comment that may have impacted you in a way that I didn't intend. I can recognize that hitch in myself and not freak out. I can just say it, so it's like it's a very practical tool, to live in just relationship with others, even in the current moment where we're looking at um, really profound differences. To be able to communicate is the most important thing, to be able to connect. And then finally, with progress, it is a different orientation to not just working towards this ideal of justice or liberation or community in the future, but it's working to a more just present. So so instead of focusing this chronotope on this like linear trajectory towards the future, we're also saying what is off in the present, what can be adjusted right now about this moment, and how can we work towards it, even though it is perhaps a perfection, it's an idealist notion that we can never have perfect justice. I don't think, I think I say something to that effect in the article. Like it's not like people think, oh yeah, we're all going to be, singing Kumbaya and enacting justice and fixing everything. But it gives us that capacity to live for something in the moment rather than just consistently working towards something in the possible future. So it's a really long explanation. And I think it kind of offers an overview of both the project that this was a part of and the article overall.
I'm very grateful though because I was gonna say something to that effect. When I was reading the article and I saw mention of the project, I was like, well, I want to know what this is. I'm gonna check it out. And so I came up on the website. And so I think that having
Mm.
these two pieces together just makes for a fascinating read, but also an interactive and like almost embodied perspective of the things that you're talking about in the article. And I think that unpacking every single thing, first, just contemporary definitions of social justice, and then how adding that embodied component, I think, like you say, it's not that they're pitted against each other. It's more kind of like how, oh, if we look at it from the embodied somatopic perspective, it opens up a lot more as far as the facets of responsibility and recognition and progress that I think, you do a really good job at kind of talking about the project, but then also, okay, here are the things that we saw from this one question. I just thought all of
Yeah,
the things together were so
yeah.
interesting.
That was the most difficult thing. I don't know if that's one of your questions, but that was definitely one of the most difficult in any writing about this project, other than our book, which is um, really like it's a coffee table book. These are all images contributed by on the board back here,
Oh, cool.
collaborators during the time capsule and stuff. So it's really um, just just a total overview. And I've really struggled in trying to, in presentations and in the couple of academic articles I've written, to like just sort of describe the whole project and then zoom in on some specific aspect of it. And I'm really glad that you brought up the somatopic, right, which I did not introduce. In my overview, which really constitutes the pivot point, or the central focus of our article, and which I found after writing it, in response to one reviewer who was really supportive, and just really engaged deeply with the theory, and asked some great questions that pushed me to organize it around a single theory in a new way. And so it was from there that I found this idea of somatopes. And so Ramona Fernandez 2015 is the I think a literary scholar, um, work to develop this notion of the somatope. So the somatope is really a chronotope, but one that puts the body at the center. So it's a really fun article. I definitely recommend it. So it looks at, a cyborg, um, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and all the vampire, the CSI Bones, anything where the body, it constitutes the center of the pivot point for the narrative, right? So whereas in a chronotope, if the road is the central chronotope, the road makes the story go on. As people walk down the road, the story proceeds, right? Or if the parlor constitutes the center, it's like when things happen in the parlor, the narrative moves forward. With somatopic narratives, when things happen to a body or the body, things move forward. And it really affords this really unique and open-ended engagement with what bodies are, right? So I'll refer everyone to Fernandez to read that. Some of the other articles I've cited in there have looked at somatopes in, for example, the work of Octavia Butler, um, especially the Wild Seed series, where you have this constant transformation of Anyanwu, and we have these bodies who eat other bodies to become to gain power, and it's really bodies that forward that whole series, and so I was thrilled to just play with, does this work? And I think this is an example of research that just is truly emergent, in terms of like inductive, it was the coding and the organization of, and this one was obviously easy to code because social justice definitions, and we just put those together. In terms of the more refined coding and noticing, there were a lot of overlaps. This is a community that is exposed to a lot of the same literature, a lot of the same instructors, right? So there's a coherence to it, that lent itself to kind of easeful, joyful coding, even. And uh, and it was from that it grew, right? And then we came with the more top down, like, okay, well, what are the definitions from the UN and the World Health Organization and the other folks who are sort of kind of giving us top, they might argue they're not necessarily top-down definitions, but in terms of the research process, taking those top-down and bottom-up engagements with it, and then sort of this flower blooms at that intersection, and then finding the idea of somatopes was really cool because it just applied kind of on top of that and provided a central pivot as well as an opportunity to lift up the work of scholars that I hadn't, been exposed to, that I don't think a lot of anthropologists are necessarily exposed to, because we're in different fields. Um, and really, really generative in terms of thinking about, well, how, so if in regular definitions of social justice or mainstream or whatever, that was one of the hard things that I couldn't figure out how to call them, like in these shared but unshared and common but not necessarily uniform definitions of social justice that prevail. um, what moves the narrative forward? And it's the ideal of equality, it's the ideal of recognition, and it's the ideal of progress, right? And all of those are, like I said, very important. um it's the idea of equal rights, the idea of equal access. There's no bodies, unfortunately. I mean, there's the body politic, right? It looks at the body of citizenship, which is a fantastic, I mean, we are part of a bigger body, but it's not necessarily the individual embodied experience. It's not necessarily part of that definition at all. So it's additive more than contrastive, if that makes sense. So when those narratives start to pivot, we can see when we have more uh, more accessible programs, uh, that moves the narrative forward. When we have a recognition of rights, that moves the narrative forward. When we progress in terms of policy, that moves the narrative forward. Where are bodies in that? So with the somatopic reframings that were offered by collaborators, it was really like, you know, that when we put the body at the center of the ideal of equality, what does that mean? That means that my body and your body are 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 we we're interconnected. We are, we're seeing one another's body in that very moment, right? Um, which you can give access to all kinds of folks, but if people don't feel comfortable in this space, that doesn't that's still there's still something missing for that. So what does it take to really be in circle, to quote Sam Grant, to be in a circle with someone and to recognize my lineage and your lineage and see what we really bring and sort of be able to contribute, not the same amounts each, but equally, right, to the shared moment, right? Um, and then in terms of, recognition, this is, I mentioned this a little earlier, like seeing one's own body as it experiences, or as we witness injustice in ourselves or in others in the world, right? How does that resonate in our own body, right? If we see something that we read as injustice, how does that feel, right? How does that feel? And it takes a lot to slow down and pause. I think a lot of times folks will be like, that feels bad. Let's do something. Let's put up a statement, or let's protest and let's do something. And I'm not saying it's not important to do something. However, I think the work that my amazing group of collaborators have really shown me is like it's a breath in that moment. That's hard. I see you, to say I see you in this moment, and how do I respond? it takes more than just the reaction, right? And when our actions are based in a lot of people slowly taking that breath and responding more slowly, the idea is, and I'm not guaranteeing this, but the idea is that it will lead to movements that have more lasting impact, that are able to stretch maybe across boundaries of that are now seen as insurmountable. And this is not exclusive. It does not want anybody's destruction. It is a movement to support life, right? And that's and it to not to say it's all life, but it's all life. It's how do we live together? How do we recognize one another, be together, on a planet? I like to say, well, I don't want to be quoted on saying this, but I could say we're monkeys on a rock hurling through space, right? You know that quote, right? What do we do? How do we do? We're in this together, right? We are in this together. And so what we do together is what is happening to all of us. Um, so it kind of gets down to one of the core sort of theory practices in embodied social justice, which comes from Eastern spirituality, indigenous philosophy, Black feminism, this idea of where does the self end and where does the other begin, right? Does the self end with me and my neighbor, or does it end with me and my community, or just is it me and my family, or is it just literally my body? Or does it include you, right? So you stretch that even further and further out. When you're recognizing injustice out there, it's in here,
Hmm.
right? So this is Martin Luther King's idea that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, and that's where I feel like it really, but it grounds it in the body, so I can see it, and there's something I can do other than total overwhelm and dismay. Um, so that's the body and world somato. So where is my body in this? How do I fit? And then the world and body somatope is all of the ways in which all of us, every single one of us, have been affected by injustice that has been enacted in the past. So whether our ancestors are perpetrators or victims or both, right? We all have both. Then we have a legacy to confront in ourselves. So a lot of the work looks individual. It looks like meditating. It looks very quiet, right? It doesn't look like protesting and yelling and working on policy groups completely. I mean, that is part of it. There's this aspect of the work that is really intense, whether people call it intergenerational trauma or suffering. And then this really comes from a lot of people's work. I'll just name Resmaa Menakem, who's the author of My Grandmother's Hands, who looks at how racial injustice has affected all people in the U.S. and no matter where we are, how we're connected to it, um, and so doing the work of recognizing that. So this is not going to be incredibly. I mean, I really want this to be understood right now
Yeah,
because
yeah.
it is inclusive. It is like it's for everybody. It is
Mhm.
not a sort of it's it's not a far left condemn the right
Mhm.
community at all, right? So a lot of the cancel culture that has been critiqued on the left is a symptom that we're looking at in embodied justice, right? We're looking at how do we not cancel people? How do we call people in instead of call them out,
Right.
right? So I want to just underscore that it is a community that is very much critical of some of the sort of the caricatures of the liberal, movements. Um, are really called into question. Like, what does it mean to adopt the oppressor position, and how do we benefit from adopting the oppressor position, and in what ways are we not actually entirely in that position, right? In what ways do we have privilege, right? So it's kind of expanding on this. It is a caricature of the liberal movement that I think is really um, traveling across spaces right now. Um, that that these practices are for everyone, and that we can learn to um, see within ourselves what part of ourselves are we rejecting by rejecting someone else for not saying the right words, or for, you know what I mean, if someone feels like they need to walk on eggshells all the time and they can't speak around, I'll say us, uh then what's the problem there? How can we better explain where we're coming from? Because, like I said, I think a lot of people do value life ultimately, on the at least at the level of, you know, people in a room.
Yeah, I think that I think that the body, even though it seems like a really simple, like, oh yeah, like we all have bodies, like I think it goes so much deeper than that. Like you're saying, kind of being aware of experiences that other people are having in the world, whether that's through thinking of the embodied social justice or just even much simpler, just like I have a body, you have a body, and we all kind of feel very similar things about similar situations. And, where does our understanding of each other come from that? Or where can we find understanding of each other from our embodied experiences? I think that unpacking that and making those ideas like tangible and accessible is really important to sort of push these conversations forward.
Yeah. Like, it's like, where do you feel oppressed? Not because of your blah, 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 these are your identities. So therefore, I acknowledge that you are an oppressed person. But how do you feel that? And that, as we've seen recently, can be anyone who does not feel seen and who does not feel welcome in a space,
Absolutely.
right? Whether or not we judge those reasons to be valid.
Hmm.
Um, Being able to see that that doesn't feel good,
Hmm.
right? That justice does not, social justice, so that means equality, recognition, and progress within the world, does not mean exclusion
Right.
of anyone,
Absolutely.
right? And so when people do feel excluded, it it's a real suffering, right? And striving to understand how that person might feel is difficult in some cases. Now, and I'm almost, looking at one of the things. I mean, this isn't a question you've asked me, but one of the things that I struggle with is how can we conduct a real ethnography of the entire political spectrum, and really use the tools of our field to understand everyone, and to provide some sort of ethnographic insight into how we can possibly move past
Hmm.
some of the things facing us right now. I'm actually not going to position myself as someone who's particularly well. Um, I have a lot more capacity, growing somatic bandwidth to work on, to be able to do that work. But I think it's really, that's kind of what I'm edging up against, this idea that we can um, work to understand one another,
Hmm.
and um, and live together.
Absolutely. I think that it sounds like a really, I mean, I think it is a huge undertaking and a big ask. And like you say, having that recognition of like, I don't know that I could do it, but I think that I think it's good that we're maybe considering moving towards, getting to somewhere that
Mhm.
we can all understand each other. And I think and I hope that, with the work that you've done and the work that the um Living Justice Project members and collaborators have done. I mean, I hope that this is something that the people out there, anybody can read and access and maybe start to shift those gears and say, wait a minute, we can think about other things like differences and similarities this way, or we can undertake a big question like that in a similar fashion through ethnography, through conversation, collaboration. I mean, it sounds like big and scary, right? But I think it's the same thing as that whole progress chronotope where like it really seems like it's far out there and impossible, but I think that we're maybe starting to reach that there's a way to do this somewhere somehow, and this might be kind of the start of it, I think.
Oh, I mean, I want to say when you say this, the start of it, it is we're very it's difficult to not think in terms of chronotopes of start and finish and
Right,
progress,
right.
right?
Sorry.
Because we're I think about that because we're forward facing, our eyes and like
Yes.
this has to do even like we go back to like different cultures think about, the past is up and but then the future is down. And for us, we're thinking in these linear terms and like starting point, ending point. Um, and I mean, I like to think of this as a lineage that is consistent and that has always existed, right? There's never been a time where at least some folks at a small scale are thinking in these terms. And what's interesting now in terms of doing time capsule research is that it is like, okay, so the time capsule was in 2022. Already we're seeing a very different world. I hadn't anticipated it would be so quick that we would see a shift. But it's like, how do we apply it now? Not just now in a broad sense, but now in this very moment, in this conversation, right? How can we apply it? How can we take part in a lineage that cuts across race, it cuts across gender, it cuts across socioeconomics, and it has always cut across these groups, right? So it is an alliance. Of bodies who care, and it's not new, and it's not necessarily a starting point, but anyone can jump in from any starting point, which I think is what you were saying, and I wanted to clarify.
Yes, no, this
um,
is this is see this is helpful. And I think that having this conversation, I think, brings forward like you knew what I was thinking and you're able to explain it in a much, that's exactly it, that you've encapsulated it really well. And I want to thank you
yeah,
for, oh, go ahead, Sam. Do you have a thought?
sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I just had one more thing in terms of like, that anybody can join us. Like I have given a few public talks and we'll be doing more. And actually collaborators around the world will be doing, we're creating a talk that anyone can do. Any one of the 54 of us can do. Um, and it introduces our book, which, as I said, is a coffee table book for the public that is just invites anyone to participate with us. Um, and it is organized really, really, it's organized into several sections. On one of us, with Charlotte Burton, a collaborator, really pushed me to get the alliteration together because I had a number of P words. So it's presence, purpose, practice, partnership, and possibility. And so it really has sections that have art and have poetry and and photography from each collaborator that really invite people to consider what is presence. What
Mhm.
does it mean to have purpose? And that's I stay away from the word chronotopes in the book, but that's really a chronotope. What does it mean to have a direction, right? And what does it mean to practice? So how do we practice when we're bombarded with the news? How do we practice when we're in a moment of conflict? How do we practice when we uh, recognize that our bodies are tired and we need to turn everything off and rest? How do we practice and show up to be present, right? So presence not just in terms of a body like squishy spiritual presence, but like how do we be present, right? And then partnership is not just with, our partners. It's with our communities, with our um, the people who challenge us, right? Um, and of course, possibility is a future that includes, anyone can join. I can see where, seeing our we're a very, very diverse group in many ways, very racially diverse, and diverse in terms of age 23 to 72. Um, we have 44 cis female, six trans non-binary, and four cis men. So we have some work to do to feel more inclusive for men, I guess. And but it's available to anyone, and I don't think it necessarily requires a certain, I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't, I'm not going to go so far as it says. I think it shifts. It's fun. I mean, it's just a really fun community to be a part of. Like it's not, it's also very intense. It takes a lot of work. But it's like these are the coolest people in the world that have ever met, and I just am so overjoyed to do the work of sharing. I mean, I think of myself, that's the last thing I'll say is I think of myself as not a leader in the field of embodied social justice by any means. I've been adjacent to it for a long time, 20 years maybe. In terms of folks that have developed initiatives. I have never been a teacher of it. I do not lead classes in it. I'm an anthropologist. So my unique role, and that's one of the things, is we all have a role to play in this. This is not for just anybody. I mean, it's for like certain folks, right? It's for everybody, and everyone has a role to play. That role is maybe different. So, what is your unique intelligence? Part of the practice of this has helped me understand that my role is to document, it, and do micro analyses of like chronotopes of things. You know what I mean? It's not the answer. It's not the only answer by any means. Um, Yet it has something to offer. And I think, what I am just so overjoyed to do is to use this work to direct readers to those folks out there who make their living from teaching these classes. So if you look at the Embodied Social Justice Certificate Program, if you look at Prentice Hemphill's Embodiment Institute, if you look at, Stacey Haynes' Politicized Somatics or somatic, and if you look at Ray Johnson, like they're offering Res Momentum, they're offering workshops that are, accessible and that teach these skills. I'm not teaching them. I'm just kind of, I'm like, here's this community, join us. Uh, you know, um, I think my publisher was like, wanted to say I'm a leader in the field. And I said, no, I'm not. I'm like, I'll lead you to the leaders,
Yeah.
but I'm not, that's not my role.
But I still think it's wonderful. And like you're saying, right, you're like collecting all these resources for people to then, it's like you have this article out, and then I saw that you had all these links available to the project and to these workshops. And I think that having a hub and somewhere to start from, I think it helps a lot of people engage in conversations they may not have been engaging in or didn't know how. So just thank you and thank all the collaborators for
Yeah, and a lot of the collaborators too are leaders in the field, so their links are there too.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you so much again for this like wonderful conversation. It was really wonderful for me to kind of get into the specifics of it with you. I loved hearing all about the article. And before I kind of end the interview officially, we've talked about all these links that are available in the book, but I would just like to know if any readers are curious about any future research or wanting to get into contact with you, any questions. Is there anywhere they could reach out to you?
Absolutely. And my email is available on my UA website. So if you just Google my name, it could be easy to find. We also have an open hybrid lab called Embodiment Communication and Health Open CoLab. It's the Echo Lab. And we meet weekly and we encourage, all students, faculty, people who are interested to come join us either in a hybrid form or if they're on campus in Alabama to join us in person. And just, email me. We have the livingjusticeproject.com is our website, and we'll have updates on the book there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it.
Sure.